Okay, Katrina McGowan, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. We were just talking a little bit off air, and I just want to congratulate you on the documentary "How to Poison a Planet." I was really impressed not only by how it was all put together, really shocked by the information, and it was just it touched my heart as well because it's so close to home, and like we're both Aussies, which I'm really proud to sort of I guess that you're an Aussie and you're creating documentaries like this, and I was inspired to learn that this is not your first rodeo either.
Do you mean with filmmaking?
Filmmaking and documentaries.
Yeah, well, in a way it was. This was my first time directing a documentary.
Oh,
So
no
I've
way.
been, yeah, so I've been working for the company that produced the film iKANDY Films with producer Janine Hosking for about 10 years. So
Hmm.
we've worked together on a number of other projects and I've produced other films, but this was my first time directing. So it was definitely taking on a whole nother level. But no, it was an incredible experience, obviously, and it took a long time. It was about 4 years in the making, or over 4 years by the time we finished it. But it was just one of those stories that really grew and grew,
Hmm.
and we didn't really know when we started it where it would end. But we took our time with it, and we're able to put a very big story really into about 95 minutes. So it was a bit of a challenge.
Yeah,
We got
yeah,
there.
yeah. You did such a great job. Can I ask when you took on this role? Was it something that you were familiar with in terms of forever chemicals and PFAS and all that kind of stuff? Is that something that was on your register already in terms of what's going on in the world or not?
Not at all.
Really?
I saw it on the news. It was 2008, 18 maybe. And it was just a news story in the morning one morning about communities around Australia that had sued the Defence Force for the contamination of their land or their homes with forever chemicals from firefighting foam. So the Defence Force bases had been using this foam on the bases. It had leached into the waterways and surrounding lands, and now these communities, it was Oakey, Catherine, and Williamtown, were suing the Defence Force. So I just saw that and thought, oh, I've never even heard of that before, and how, kind of wanted to learn more. So I reached out to the lawyers who were running those cases, Shine Lawyers, who feature in the film, and spoke to Josh there. And he said, yeah, we're just about to settle these three, but we have seven other cases that we're about
Wow.
to launch, seven other sites that have also been contaminated. And one of those sites was Wreck Bay. And so I knew Wreck Bay, obviously knew that area. And so our producer, Matt Cornwell, and I went down to meet with community members down there. And that was really the first time that I started to understand the impact of what this contamination was having on this community in particular, but other communities. And in Wreck Bay, they were suffering not only from having their land and waterways contaminated, but it's an Aboriginal community, and it was severely affecting their cultural practices. And one of their main waterways, Mary's Creek, where they had been fishing, children would swim there all the time. It was a drinking source, a water, source. That creek was severely contaminated. The surrounding areas were contaminated, so they couldn't collect their bush medicine. And it was also a community that was incredibly sick. Everyone we spoke to had a tragic story of illness. So that was really the beginning. So we sort of went back
Wow.
and said, well, we think this is a film. We should look into this. And then it went from there.
Yeah, that's incredible. Do you are you shocked about just how many of these or how prevalent these forever chemicals are in almost everything that we do in our daily lives?
Yes, these chemicals have managed to spread into the blood of 98% of the world's population. So they've found these chemicals in polar bears, they've found them in the rain, they've found them in the snow on Everest. They are everywhere. They've just spread and spread. And one of the reasons that they've done that is they're called forever chemicals. So they do not break down in the environment. So
Hmm.
they just get pumped out into the world, and more get pumped out, and it just spreads and spreads, and they transfer through waterways, through soil. They're very mobile, so they get into drinking water, food sources. So the sheer scope of this is quite shocking.
Yeah.
And at the time when we first started the film, really not a lot was known. there were journalists, obviously Carrie Fellner, who we worked with for the film. She'd been reporting on it and a bit overseas, but it really has been in the last maybe 4 or 5 years that it started to really become, I think, to the front of everyone's minds. It's kind of crazy considering everybody has this in their blood now. So yeah, it's a pretty overwhelming issue. And now these chemicals are basically in household items. We're surrounded by them. We're exposed to them every day. So it's definitely a big topic.
Yeah, it's massive. I remember watching a documentary that was based off the movie. Well, it was probably the catalyst of the movie Dark Waters.
Yeah.
So it's was talking about the forever chemicals that were being polluted in the waters that were killing cows and all that kind of stuff. But then it was like, it's in Scotchgard and carpet and Teflon and certain like fabrics and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, fuck, like all of these things are in my household all of the time. It's like, and if I think about over the years that I've used it and I've had like, my kids exposed to it and all that kind of stuff, it's a very daunting, sort of overwhelming feeling of just how much of these kind of like poisons, really toxins that are in your body. And it does make you very conscious of everything that you do from now on, like in terms of just what I drink out of, the water in the home and things like that. Even getting takeaway coffee cups and all that kind of stuff. I'm kind of like really altered my behavior over the last couple of years to a large degree. My kids used to say, like, you're an idiot, or you're a conspiracy theorist, or you don't know what you're going on about. I would just obviously sound like a nutter when you go, it's in everything, like you just like you're freaking out. But now I'm really pleased that this is coming into mainstream, because it's definitely making it top of mind and causing people to ask questions as to why isn't anything being done about this. Because if anyone is going to go and watch the documentary, and I highly recommend they should, and I'll put all the links in the show notes for this podcast. I like companies that are implicated, like 3M and things like that, like they've known about this for quite some time.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to you about the, being paranoid about everything in your home. Once I started to learn more about these chemicals, I was throwing things out and replacing everything in our home. At one point, there's a scene in Dark Waters, which is the movie that Mark Ruffalo stars in, where he comes home after he realizes and he's throwing out all his pots and pans. And I feel like I was doing that at one point as well.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's basically these chemicals, and just to set up what they are, they were developed because they're stain resistant, water resistant, non-stick. So the first sort of products that they were used in were Teflon pans. That was sort of developed in the sort of 70s and 80s or before. And then Scotchgard, which is a stain resistant spray, which everyone would know. Food packaging paper called Scotch bands. That's your takeaway, your pizza boxes, anything that sort of would repel grease, popcorn packaging and things like that. And firefighting foam, because it had this incredible ability to suppress particularly oil fires and, get anything that had sort of gas or something like that. So they were incredibly effective chemicals, and they were put in all of these products and then sold to the world. And unfortunately, the company that made these chemicals initially was 3M, and they knew in the 70s that these chemicals were having pretty severe health effects on the animals that they were testing it on, but continued to sell these products and didn't really tell anybody until the late 90s that actually not only were these chemicals potentially harmful, they were now in the blood of basically the world's population. But those chemicals that were in Teflon and Scotchgard and firefighting foam were the PFAS group, is an umbrella name. The two chemicals that we know the most about, which were in those products, are PFOA, and PFOS, PFOS. So in the early 2000s, the late 90s, 3M announced that they would phase out production of those chemicals. But there are about 14,000 other chemicals in this PFAS group. And so
Wow.
companies like 3M and other companies replaced PFOS or PFOA with just some other PFAS chemicals. A number of those haven't been studied because there's 14,000 of them, but the ones that have been studied, experts are saying that they do also, have at least one of the sort of traits that are concerning. They're persistent in the environment. They have potential health effects, or they bioaccumulate in your blood. So you don't really ever get rid of it, or you get rid of it very slowly over time.
Mm.
So the chemicals, oftentimes the ones that we're seeing in our houses, in products like makeup and things are in that umbrella. The most harmful that we know the most about, PFOS and PFOA, have largely been phased out. But like I said before, the damage has kind of been done because they were just spread out to the world. And it is quite shocking when you look at the internal documents of these companies, what they knew about these chemicals, how early they knew, and yet they continued to produce them. And not only that, once they found out, they did a study in 1979, and 20 out of the 28 monkeys in the study died when they were exposed to PFOS, which is what's in the firefighting foam. And after that point, they increased production of that chemical.
Wow.
So it's pretty shocking when you sort of learn what was known, how early on, and how little was done until decades later.
Yeah, well, like my lifetime ago, isn't it? Like,
Mm.
I was born in '78. You look
Yeah.
like younger than me, and it's just like that's my entire life that I've been exposed to it. They willingly knew about it and then kept increasing production. What pissed me off in the documentary was, and I really would love you to talk to the court proceedings and the implications, particularly when it comes to Australia, because I think everyone here in Australia, my audience is largely Australian, should know exactly what went on, what was uncovered, and how it was dealt with. What pissed me off was that there was a scene where 3M were maybe in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, were found out to have these forever chemicals. They were taken to task. They were fined a bunch of money and then said, oh, we're going to stop these forever chemicals in our production over the next 2 years, but then proceeded to run off a lot of their product, or run out at a discounted rate to all of their suppliers.
Yeah.
That is just insane.
Yeah, I think when they announced to the American EPA that they were going to phase out these chemicals, it was done over a few years. And you're right, they then sent letters out to all of their buyers around the world and said, we're phasing out these chemicals, so, buy some before we stop. Not saying, oh, hang on, it's no good, don't buy anymore. It was sort of the opposite. And the lawyer in the film says it's like a going out of business sale. That they knew it was bad, but took the opportunity to sort of continue to sell until that phase out, was official.
Mm. And can you remind me, when was that? Like, what time frame are we talking?
That was the late 90s. They
That was right. Okay.
very, very late 90s. And 2000 was when they then sent the letter to the EPA to say that they were going to phase out the chemicals.
Yeah. Does it piss you off to know that these companies are not only still in business, but also just coming under another umbrella and kind of disguising the same sort of products as something else?
Yeah, I mean, 3M was sued by the legal team that are in the film, and they ended up settling for $12.6 billion in the US. That legal case was specifically for water providers in the US who were having to clean these chemicals out of drinking water all over the country. They ended up settling. I think, in a way, you do want these companies to continue to exist, because otherwise no one's going to get their payout. If they file for bankruptcy, then no one gets anything. So, and there are a lot of people who work for 3M who are really amazing people. And so it's such a bigger, complex issue, but it's definitely quite frustrating and horrifying to know that companies got away with this kind of behavior for so long. And then, would sort of somehow, they were never really made to be held responsible. I mean, even in the film, as you see, they settle, the day before it was spent to go to
Congrats.
trial. They settle on the courthouse steps pretty much, but the settlement doesn't include any admission of liability. So it sort of feels like sometimes there's just still no real accountability for those actions and for what's become really one of the biggest environmental disasters that we've faced.
I can't believe that it's just not a top of the news bulletin type of story. I mean, like, this should be exploding. And even, I don't know what your feedback is from the documentary, but even from the documentary, I only saw an article just in the paper the other day about that there could be toxic chemicals in our water. And it's just like, it's a downplay of what our water system is like in Australia. And I think that's, I don't know, it's mind-boggling to think that it's not really just like an outrage publicly and nationally. You know what I mean?
It's really surprised me as well, and it surprised me when we started making the film how little people knew. And then when we reached out to the lawyers in America, at that point, no one had really approached them about the case, and it was going to be this huge case against 3M, and no media had been expressing too much interest. So it is really surprising. I don't know. I think part of it is just the name of the chemicals, PFAS, and polyfluoroalkylated substances. It's kind of hard to get your head around. They're in so many things, but also I think just that there hasn't been a lot of information about these chemicals and the health effects till quite late in the game, because so much of this information was hidden for so long. So the sort of scientific community has only really had about 20 years to start studying these chemicals, and that's not a lot of time. And so it's taken a while for everyone to start to really grasp the severity of these chemicals, the potential health effects that they're creating. So it's I think they just got a late start in that regard. But I agree with you. I mean, for a chemical that's so prevalent and in so many, or a bunch of chemicals that are prevalent in everything, or not everything, but so many things, it is really surprising that not as many people know about it. And I have had a lot of people who have watched the film say to me afterwards, I just had no idea. I had no idea about these chemicals. I had no idea how much they were in. I had no idea they were in our blood. And it is definitely concerning. I'm a parent as well. And, the thought that these chemicals are in our children before they're even born is a pretty terrifying thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I look at social media as a little barometer as to, like, when there's a news story like the other day with our toxic water and things like that. One post stands out where it's like, great, now my water's toxic, and it's just like, yeah, I mean, that's I was today years old when I found out for that bloke. It was just like, wow, that's a new thing for that person to discover and to realize that that's only the beginning of it, because they're probably filling up their plastic drink bottle with the same contaminated water. Like, it's just such a flow-on effect, right? So yeah,
and I think
nuts.
the thing that's quite concerning about us with Australia is Australia's safe levels of how much of this chemical can be in your drinking water is significantly higher than the US and Europe. So
really,
in the US, they had a guideline set a few years ago, and then last year they mandated that guideline. So now no water in the US, drinking water, can have PFAS chemicals above 4 parts per trillion. And the reason they set it at 4 is because you cannot test any lower than that. So basically, if there is any trace at all of these chemicals in your water, it's too much. So they've mandated that now, and that's a regulation. In Australia, we can have 70 parts per trillion of PFOS and 560 parts per trillion of PFOA, PFOA. So it's significantly higher. And there's no real reason, and it's really difficult to get any answers as to why Australia is maintaining that that's okay. So even though they're saying, well, the levels that you're finding in some of these areas, it's okay because it's below our safe guidelines, that wouldn't pass in the US and in a lot of places in Europe as well. So we're really, really behind. And as well as that, the Australian government is still maintaining that there really aren't any clear health effects from these chemicals, that the science is still out, except for maybe that it can higher cholesterol. Whereas the World Health Organization, so the World Health Organization has has now stated that PFOA is a carcinogen and that PFOS is a likely carcinogen. And there's been countless studies all over the world for years that are all saying these chemicals are really serious. We have to be careful, and they are linked to so many health effects. And you can see that in the animal studies that were done by 3M in the 70s and the 80s. They were causing really severe effects in animals. So why wouldn't they also be having those effects on people? So Australia is just really behind. It's very unclear as to why, but we've got a lot of catching up to do. And you know, from our perspective and from every Australian, we really need that to be happening faster than it is.
That's fucking outrageous.
Mm.
That is
It's quite hard to believe
outrageous.
because we follow the global science on everything else, but for some reason with this, it's sort of Australia's just lagging behind.
Right. Well, it's not only lagging, it's ignorant. You know, it's how can you not recognize that there's a precedent has been set in other parts of the world and not follow suit? And not, it's like it's a today we just found out that we're going to mandate this and regulate this thing. It's, you know, it's already in existence and has been for a number of years, even decades. That's nuts. And again,
the Australian
perception. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, and the Australian government has known about these chemicals for decades. They were testing blood in the early 2000s. They were testing breast milk in the early 2000s. So they knew these chemicals were in in Australians' blood.
Really?
Testing sites for a long time. So they knew it's not like, oh, we just found out a few years ago and now we're going to deal with it. It's been bubbling along for a long time. So, yeah.
That's crazy. Can you tell me more about the court case here in Australia, particularly pertaining to obviously Wreck Bay, our native people that were affected by there? Because I know there was a lot on the documentary that were coming forward with sickness and illness and cancers and many deaths and things like that. Can we talk to that a fair bit and just give me a bit of context around what happened, who was involved, and the consequences? I was kind of let down by how that all was played out.
Yeah. So the Wreck Bay community is situated just downhill from a naval training facility in the Booderee National Park. So it's only about 2 kilometers down from this training facility. And that was a facility where they used enormous quantities of this foam over decades for training. And they didn't know, in many cases at the time, because 3M was saying that these chemicals were biodegradable, so you can use it for training. And then that foam then leached out of the defense base and straight downhill where this village is, where children were swimming and drinking the water, where they were catching their fish. And it completely engrossed in their surroundings, and so much of that area is so important culturally to the community. So they found out in 2018 that, or defense called a meeting and said, we've contaminated the area with PFAS chemicals. It was the first they had heard about it. And so they launched a class action for cultural loss. Most of the other sites around Australia, the class actions were launched for loss of property value. So these places in all over Australia, Wagga Wagga, Bullsbrook, Katherine, Williamtown, Oakey, they were suing the defence, similar situation, how the foam had leached out, but they were suing defence for loss of property value. Wreck Bay was unique because they had a land claim, but also a cultural loss claim, which is largely unprecedented in Australia. It hasn't really happened before. So it was quite a unique case for us to follow within the film, because they could no longer, engage in these cultural practices. So the class action was launched, and the legal team, Shine Lawyers, were involved, and they were great, and we did some filming with them. And then ultimately defense settled with Wreck Bay for 22 million. And at the time, a lot of the community members were really disappointed in that settlement, because it really wasn't a lot. It sort of sounds like a lot, but comparatively to what a lot of the other sites were getting, it was quite small, and it wasn't really going to break up to be really very much for anybody. And I guess it's sort of, but it was raising a lot of questions about how do you put a price on culture? It had never been done in Australia. So some of the community members did go to the court and challenge the settlement, but unfortunately they were unsuccessful. So the 22 million was the ultimate settlement for them. But I think and it wasn't a health claim. So there's never been health claims in Australia because the Australian government still doesn't recognise health effects to PFAS. So no one can really bring a claim. So it was all for cultural loss, which has had an enormous impact on the community. But there's also obviously, it's so heightened because of this incredibly high health, these health issues that they're having there in the community. I don't think we met one person who wasn't directly affected by really severe illness. Cancers were, mostly a lot of heart disease in really young, fit men, some women as well. And, one of the cases that we show in the film is two sisters, one who was diagnosed with a brain tumor when she was just I think she was about 18. And then 2 or 3 years later, her sister's diagnosed with the same brain tumor. And this is a brain tumor that's so rare and it's never really seen in young women. So these two sisters end up with these, both with the brain tumor. So, another case, we had this really beautiful young woman, Peggy, who passed away from breast cancer. And we do know that these chemicals have sort of hormonal effects. So you do see that they are being linked to hormonal cancers like breast cancer. So it was just really, it was a lot of young people, really young people who were sick. And one of the other things that this chemical is being linked to, and it's one of the most serious health effects that we're looking at, is its ability to suppress your immune system. So if your immune system isn't functioning properly, then you're kind of opening yourself up to all kinds of illnesses. And it really affects your ability to fight cancers and things like that. So that's something that globally is of big concern. And there was a really interesting study done in the Faroe Islands where children who had higher levels of PFAS chemicals in their blood were producing something like half of the antibodies when they were getting a vaccination. So these vaccinations were being half as effective because of the PFAS in their blood. So you may not be able to directly link an illness to the chemicals, but if your immune system is not working, then then that can be resulting in higher rates of infection, disease, and all kinds of things. So in Wreck Bay, it does make you wonder perhaps if a lot of these illnesses were being caused by this exposure to these chemicals.
Yeah. Wow, that's scary.
And actually, Carrie, who's in the film, a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald, she managed to find some data that did suggest that over a few year periods, Wreck Bay had the highest rates of premature death in the whole country. And some rates it had the highest, and in other years it had one of the highest rates. So, it was being borne out in the data, what we were seeing on the ground, which was that, this community was incredibly sick.
When you tell stories like this, when you think about particularly firefighting foam, I mean, like how many fire engines do you see, running to a scene and putting out fires and things like that? Like it wouldn't just be synonymous, obviously, to just Wreck Bay. I mean, has anyone else started to like join the dots in terms of other clusters of areas that have illness or higher rates of death in young people and all the things that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so fire stations, areas surrounding fire stations around the country are starting to find a lot of them have PFAS contamination. Airports as well are another hotspot for the contamination. So I don't know exactly how many sites, but I'd say there would be maybe over 100 sites, possibly more, that have various levels of exposure. But yeah, definitely the firefighters were some of the most exposed to these chemicals, just like the defense personnel who are using the foam. The firefighters have been really highly exposed, and there's some incredible work being done by a guy called Mick Tisbury to uncover, this issue, and he's fantastic helping us with the film. So that's a really tragic thing, I think, is they're actually having really high levels of health issues with firefighters who are using this foam over decades. They don't use it anymore, but they used it up until, it's hard to know when it was phased out, particularly with defense, but they sort of said they started to phase it out from around 2004.
Oh, is that right?
So the foam that's being used now around shouldn't contain PFAS chemicals.
Yeah.
But 2004 wasn't that long ago, and yeah, so again, a lot of that damage was done. But yeah, there would be sites all over Australia, and I think the more they're studying it, the more they're investigating it, the more they're finding, unfortunately.
Well, what's currently happening in this space? Do you know, or are you aware of other legal battles or anything that's sort of erupted as a result of the work that you guys have done, and obviously the subsequent movies and docos?
Well, we're having a parliamentary screening actually in a couple of weeks for the film, which is going to be hosted by the independent Senator David Pocock. He's gotten behind the film, and so we're hopeful that the film will get to be put in front of some of the really key decision makers in Parliament who can maybe fast track some action on this issue. There's been sort of talk about the potential of the Australian government suing 3M. I don't know how far along that is. So that's potentially in the works. I mean, I think there's a lot of people suing 3M around the world at the moment. And yeah, I mean, I think we just need action on this issue. We really need to firstly lower these safe levels and come into line with the rest of the world saying there's no exposure is safe. A little bit of PFAS is not okay. We don't want any PFAS in our drinking water. Accepting the health effects, obviously, as well, is a really important one, acknowledging that they are a concern. So more serious action is taken. And I think also the Australian government banned PFOS and PFOA, those two that I was talking about earlier. So they'll be phased out by 2025. So they've been legal to still come into this country up until, or they're still coming in, but they will be banned by 2025. But we want to make sure that not just those two are banned. There's a whole class of chemicals. There's 14,000 of them, and really we should be looking at them as a group. In Minnesota last year, they managed to ban, it's the first state anywhere in the world that has actually banned all PFAS chemicals, not just those couple. So that, and I think also the other thing is just that right to know. I think that people need to know where these chemicals are in their homes and in their environment and how they can avoid them. So if all of those other PFAS chemicals aren't going to be banned, at least make it mandated that you have to disclose that product has PFAS chemicals in it, so that people can read the label and go, okay, I don't want to buy that. Because if you don't know that they're there, you can't protect yourself from them. So so there's sort of a number of things that we think would be, what we hope the film can help with, to try and kind of get some action on this important issue.
What do you think? Like, it's hard for me to hear things like, we hope that you can lower the levels, or at least label things so we know that it's poisoning us, right? Like, it's just it doesn't compute with me in terms of, why isn't it just completely eliminated straight away? But I understand the legalities of it, and I understand that it's a long process for these things to sort of come about. And considering that at the beginning of this conversation, this is new information to a lot of people. It was new information to you a couple of years ago. Like, it's just, I think a lot more work needs to be done in terms of exposing to people just how common these forever chemicals is. The thing that annoys me is that the two that you mentioned, the PFOA and the PFAS, whatever the AS one, I mean, there's 13,998 others that you could easily just disguise as, it's not the ones, it's not the dangerous ones that we're thinking about. We're just allowing all these things. What's next on the horizon for you guys? Is there any sort of thoughts on a follow-up or something to do with sort of creating a bit more detailed information about how this is sort of affecting anyone in the world with regards to forever chemicals?
Yeah, well, the film's been released on Stan here in Australia, but we haven't yet released it internationally. So that's our next steps, is to look at an international release so we can get the film out to the world, and particularly in the US because of the US storyline that's in there. But every day in the news in the US and the UK and everywhere, there's stories about these PFAS chemicals. So it is sort of a general kind of consciousness is starting to emerge. So yeah, I guess from the film's perspective, we just want to get it out to as many people as we possibly can and create an impact sort of campaign around the film. Get it in front of not just general population, but people who maybe are in a position to influence some change all over the world. And yeah, I mean, we'd be open to a follow-up film, and we'll just see where it takes us. But I think, I guess our hope in firstly is just raising awareness, because unless you know that they're there, you can't do anything to protect yourselves and your family. So I guess that's just sort of where we're at the moment with it.
I'll see if I can connect you. I interviewed Kashif Khan, who he's an author of a book called The DNA Way, but a lot of his information and content that he puts out is around the toxicity of the things that we do in everyday life. And he mentions PFAS on a number of occasions. I've got two little sisters, and you mentioned the thing about makeup before.
Yeah.
So he's like, by the time you put your makeup in the morning, there's something like 278 chemicals and toxins that you just put on your face, right? And these PFAS are in makeup. So yeah, my sisters are like 15 and 13, and they're just like all into their makeup naturally. So I was like, have you seen this shit? So I'm trying my hardest to kind of have an influence. But there's a few people that I've had on this podcast which I think would like to connect with you, and if you're open to it, to maybe sharing the information on their platforms as well. I think that they would really love the opportunity to kind of push this information. They definitely have a lot of clout online for sure.
That would be awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I'd love that. And I think for people watching the film or engaging with the issue, it's very overwhelming to think it's in everything around us or in so many things around us, and where do I start? So the main areas where we're most exposed in our homes particularly is non-stick cookware. So that's I think starting with what you're putting in your mouth, in your food that you're eating, is a good place to start. A lot of things that will advertise themselves as stain resistant or waterproof are often an indicator that they could use PFAS chemicals. So just being careful when you're buying, when you're looking at furniture, often, they might say it might come with a spray that you spray on the couch to stop stains. Maybe avoid that, so there's little things that you can do. Makeup is one of them. Check your brands, Google PFAS-free makeup. You can get PFAS-free makeup. Dental floss. Dental floss has PFAS in it. So little things like that, you can do the research. Carrie did a great article in the Sydney Morning Herald a few months ago about all the places in your home where these chemicals exist. So without getting too overwhelmed, those are sort of some of the places to start, and just being a little bit more conscious before you're buying certain things. When you see those things, non-stick, waterproof, stain resistant, that might just be a good idea to have your radar up and double check, ask the questions, email the company, and see, do they use PFAS chemicals, and to be careful to not mistake when it just says that it's PFOA free or PFOS free. You want it to be PFAS free, which is very confusing. But you want all those PFAS chemicals in the group. You want them all away from what you're buying. So as a starting point for people who are sort of maybe watching this and thinking, where do I start? That's sort of the best place to start. Yeah. Plastics as well, obviously, is getting rid of any of the plastics.
Just about to say,
food and
plastic containers, cling wrap, even greaseproof paper and all that kind of stuff. It is daunting and overwhelming, especially if you've got children, you're wrapping their lunches every day. Think about how you can modify. And I think also too, what is it should give people some confidence, because if you vote with your wallet, things start to change. Obviously, if you're gravitating to more brands that are free of these chemicals, then even the ones that are producing it will have to sort of either modify their manufacturing or they'll go out of business. And I think that that's not, you don't want anyone to go out of business, but when you're poisoning the planet, I think it's a really good idea that you change your business model to help people live a more happier and healthier life, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's really, really sound advice.
Yeah, and those products, that are, it's becoming much more common, that are promoting or advertising as PFAS free. They are just as effective as, in most cases, as the ones that have PFAS. So you're not necessarily having to make a trade-off.
Agreed.
These products are all still good. The makeup's still fine,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's just worth taking a look at. And like you said, particularly where if you've got kids, just being a little bit more careful with their exposure as well.
Yeah, look, Katrina, I think it's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle change, but it's also a change of habits. I think like we're just used to going to Coles or Woolies, or we've got our own little we're creatures of habit. We've got our own little routine of to where we go. And I think that it is a change in terms of, if you want more organic fruit and vegetables, well, you have to find the places that are supplying those things. If you want hormone free meat and all that kind of stuff, and ethically grown and killed and all that kind of stuff, well, there are places that do it. They're just not in the main sort of supply chains of food and things. So it does kind of stuff up your week to a degree, because you're going one place for one thing and another place for another. And it's the same with your household. Like the scene in the movie, he's throwing out all their pots and pans. It's the same.
Yeah.
Like you've got air fryers and your plastic bottles and your drinking bottles for the gym and all that kind of stuff. You're like, fuck, like this is very daunting. I've pretty much got to change everything out. But over time, it just tends to, I don't know, naturally occur. If you have a consciousness around what you're doing, you just phase out the old and you bring in the new, and eventually that just becomes your way of life again. And I think it's not a bad thing. Like when you consider that death is a consequence, right, of just following old habits. I mean, that's if that's not motivating you, I don't know what will.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Doing things gradually. I think you can't just go to get rid of everything in your house in one go, or panic, because it's too overwhelming to try and do that. But that gradual shift and change. But the tricky thing is it's expensive. It can be really expensive to take all of those approaches. Even just replacing your cookware can be expensive. So that's the frustrating thing, that it shouldn't be so expensive to avoid these chemicals, and to not, for your children to avoid these chemicals. I think that's the frustrating thing, because it shouldn't be something that you can only do if you've got that spare money. We shouldn't be exposed to these things. They shouldn't be in these products anyway. But hopefully, as this consciousness grows, more of these products will just naturally have these phased out anyway, and it won't be such a big concern for people. But it's tough, and it is completely overwhelming, to particularly chemicals like this. But definitely that gradual change, that consciousness, check the labels, email the companies, take that time where you can. And then, like you said, over time, you'll start to sort of, it will become a little bit more perhaps habit, or just you'll have, the slow evolution of your home will eventually sort of be more or less free from these chemicals.
Yeah,
As much
absolutely.
as it can be, really.
Yeah, that's right. Do what you can when you can.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time and effort. Congratulations again on the documentary. I think it was fabulous, and
Thank you.
I really hope that you get worldwide recognition for what you're doing, because the information is pertinent. If anyone's listened to at least 3 minutes of this conversation, they'll know that it's right on your doorstep, and something that should be done ASAP. And particularly for us Australians, like you have shocked me with that information that you shared today about the levels in our water and things like that. That's nuts. So anyway, I appreciate you. Thanks for everything that you do.
No, thank you.
I'll connect you with as many people as I possibly can to see if we can get some
Thank
more
you.
people to share your documentary and get this publicly known and worldwide known. So yeah, again, thanks again for your
Awesome.
time.
Thank you so much. Really lovely to meet you as well. We'll
Likewise. Yeah, we'll
okay.
catch up. We're only around the corner from each other.
Yeah, sounds
What
good.
a small world.
We'll have to. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Cool.
See
All
you.
right, Katrina. Bye now.
Bye.